Single dad was kicked off first class by a flight attendant. 1 minute later, she was on her knees. The morning began like so many others in Daniel Harper's life, with the quiet discipline that only a single parent learns to master, waking before the sun, packing a small blue backpack with crayons, a half-read storybook, a change of clothes, and the worn-out stuffed dinosaur his 5-year-old son Noah refused to sleep without. Daniel moving carefully through the small apartment so he wouldn't wake the boy too early. Because today mattered more than most days. Today was the flight to Seattle, the flight to the hospital where Noah's final evaluation would determine whether the experimental treatment he had been waiting for was finally approved. A treatment Daniel had spent 2 years fighting insurance companies, charities, and time itself to access. A treatment that might give his son a future longer than the careful, frightening timelines doctors spoke about in lowered voices. And as Daniel buttoned his plain gray shirt, the one he wore to court hearings and medical consultations alike, he took a breath, steady and practiced, reminding himself that calm was a skill, not a feeling, and that Noah needed that calm more than anything else. At the airport, the crowds pressed in like a living tide, announcements echoing overhead, wheels of suitcases humming against polished floors, and Daniel held Noah's small hand firmly, feeling the warmth and life in it, silently promising again that he would do everything he could, even when everything felt like it wasn't enough. And when they reached the gate, Daniel checked the boarding passes one more time. First class, a word that still felt strange to him, not because he didn't belong there as a person, but because his life had not known comfort for a long time, and the only reason they were sitting in those seats was a donation from a private foundation that specialized in helping families like his travel for critical care. And Daniel had almost refused it, pride rising before reality pushed it back down, because pride did nothing for sick children, and reality demanded humility. When boarding began, a flight attendant with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile stood at the entrance, scanning passes quickly, efficiently, her name tag reading, Melissa, and when Daniel stepped forward with Noah, juggling the backpack and a small medical pouch that never left his side, Melissa's eyes flicked from the pass to Noah and then back again, her smile tightening just a fraction, the kind of change most people wouldn't notice, but Daniel had become an expert at noticing small changes, especially in adults looking at his son, and she cleared her throat, saying, "Sir, first-class boarding is for premium passengers," and Daniel, still polite, still calm, replied, "Yes, I know, that's us," holding out the passes again. And she took them, scanning more slowly this time, her eyebrows knitting together as if the paper itself offended her expectations, and she said, "These seats are very limited, and we have a full cabin today," and Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old fear that came with being judged, measured, and found wanting, and he said quietly, "They were assigned to us by the airline," and Noah squeezed his hand, sensing the shift, and Melissa looked down at the boy, then back up at Daniel, her voice lowering but sharpening, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while I clarify this," and Daniel stepped aside because arguing in public rarely helped, and because Noah was watching, and because dignity sometimes meant patience even when patience hurt, and as other passengers streamed past them, some glancing, some staring, some pretending not to see, Daniel felt himself shrinking. Not as a man, but as a moment, pushed to the edge of someone else's inconvenience. And after a minute that felt much longer, Melissa returned, her expression now firm, final, and she said, "I'm sorry, but these seats are reserved, you'll need to move to economy," and Daniel's heart dropped, not because of comfort, but because the seats in first class allowed Noah to lie flatter if his breathing became difficult, because they were closer to the front in case of emergency, because the foundation had insisted on it for medical reasons, and Daniel said, still controlled, "There must be a mistake. My son has medical clearance for these seats," and Melissa's jaw tightened, her professionalism cracking into something colder as she replied, "Sir, I don't have time for this, please don't make a scene," and something in those words, the implication that he was the problem, that his presence itself was disruptive, cut deeper than the refusal, and Noah's voice, small and uncertain, asked, "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" And Daniel swallowed hard, knelt to Noah's level, and said softly, "No, buddy. You didn't do anything wrong," but Melissa heard it, and perhaps for the first time, something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty or discomfort, but she pushed on, gesturing toward the aisle behind them, "Sir, now please," and Daniel stood, his face burning, his mind racing through options, appeals, explanations, all of them feeling too slow, too fragile, and then a man in a dark suit a few steps away paused, watching, and a woman behind him whispered something sharp under her breath, and the air around them thickened with attention, and finally Daniel said, "If you check the notes on the reservation, you'll see," but Melissa cut him off, "I've made my decision," and for a moment, Daniel considered compliance, the easier path, the one that avoided conflict, but then he looked at Noah, pale, tired, trusting, and something steadied in him, and he said, clearly, without raising his voice, "I'm not moving my son until you check the medical authorization on our booking," and the silence that followed was heavy, the kind that makes every sound sharper, every breath louder, and Melissa's face flushed, anger or embarrassment rising, and she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a new voice entered the moment, calm, authoritative, "Is there a problem here?" And the airline's lead attendant, an older woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, stepped forward, and Melissa turned quickly, explaining in rushed fragments about seating, policy, delays, and the lead attendant listened without interrupting, then turned to Daniel, "May I see your passes, sir?" And Daniel handed them over, along with the folded medical letter he carried everywhere, and the lead attendant read carefully, her expression changing line by line, the way a face does when assumptions fall apart, and she looked at Noah, really looked this time, seeing the faint bruising on his arm from IV lines, the medical alert bracelet half hidden under his sleeve, and her mouth tightened, not in disapproval, but in something like regret, and she handed the documents back to Daniel, saying, "Mr. Harper, please accept my apologies, your seats are, of course, valid, and medically indicated," and then she turned to Melissa, her voice low but unmistakably firm, "I need to speak with you," and Melissa's confidence drained in an instant, replaced by shock, and as passengers pretended not to listen while listening to every word, the lead attendant continued, "You will also apologize to this family," and Melissa's eyes widened, her posture stiffening, and for a moment it looked like she might resist, but then she saw the faces around her, the reality of what had happened settling in, and slowly, visibly, the hardness in her expression cracked, and she turned back to Daniel and Noah, and something remarkable happened, something no one expected. Melissa bent down, not in performance, not for show, but because standing suddenly felt wrong, because the weight of her mistake pressed her downward, and she went down on her knees in the aisle, right there between the seats and the watching crowd, her voice shaking as she said, "I am so sorry," and the words came out raw, unpolished, "I judged you, and I was wrong, I didn't listen, and I didn't see you, and I made your day harder when it's already hard enough," and Noah stared at her with wide eyes, and Daniel felt the tight knot in his chest loosen just a little, not because of victory, but because of recognition, and Melissa continued, tears welling despite her efforts, "I've been doing this job for 7 years, and I tell myself I treat everyone the same, but today I let my assumptions decide for me, and I'm ashamed," and the cabin was utterly silent now, no whispers, no rustling, just the shared gravity of a human moment unfolding at 30,000 feet before it had even begun. And Daniel didn't know what to say at first, because apologies don't erase fear, and humility doesn't undo pain, but he also knew that this moment, too, was being watched by Noah, and lessons are taught as much by response as by action, and so Daniel placed a hand on Noah's shoulder and said, "Thank you for apologizing," his voice steady, "We're just trying to get my son to his doctor," and Melissa nodded, wiping her face, "I understand now," and the lead attendant helped her to her feet, addressing the nearby passengers with a composed smile, "Thank you for your patience, we'll be boarding shortly," and as Daniel and Noah took their seats in first class, the space felt different, not luxurious, not triumphant, but quieter, more human, and Noah settled in, clutching his dinosaur, and whispered, "Daddy," she said sorry, and Daniel smiled gently, "Yes, she did," and Noah thought for a moment, then said, "That was brave," and Daniel felt a sting behind his eyes, because children often understand courage more clearly than adults, and as the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the ground and its judgments behind, Melissa passed by once more, this time stopping briefly, her voice calm, sincere, "If you need anything at all during the flight, please let me know," and Daniel nodded, "Thank you," and there was no bitterness in it, only closure, and as clouds rolled past the window, Daniel rested his head back, listening to Noah's even breathing, thinking not about being right or wrong, but about how quickly dignity can be taken, and how powerful it is when someone chooses to give it back, And in that narrow cabin, high above the world, a single father, a tired flight attendant, and a watching child all learned something lasting about empathy, humility, and the quiet strength it takes to kneel, not in defeat, but in understanding.